Hey everybody. It's been a while since the last time that I published a video on the PyRevit YouTube channel, but this time I have a pretty good reason. There's a new feature in PyRevit that I'm really excited about, and I think you will be also. It's a feature that I've been working on, at least fantasizing about it for a while, and finally I got a good free chunk of time that I could sit down and finish this. And basically, this is the official beta version publish of this feature, and I would love for you guys to be able to play with it and see if it find the shortcomings and stuff. So PyRevit 4.7.6 is out. There's a lot of improvements and stuff in terms of closing issues and merging other PRs and adding tools and whatnot. But the most important feature is this new feature that I'm going to talk about, PyRevit Roots HTTP API micro framework. And I'll explain in a little bit of detail what this really is. Um, Throughout this conversation, I'll show you a couple of links on the PyRevit Wiki. If you don't know what that is, you can search for PyRevit, and if you find the PyRevit repo, you can click on the wiki.pyrevitlabs.io, and it'll take you to the PyRevit Wiki. So anything that I'll show you sort of like inside this environment, that would be the PyRevit Wiki that you all have access to. So let's talk about PyRevit Roots server and the HTTP API framework. Um, Imagine you have a client machine and a server machine. Imagine I want to build a web application that runs in a browser, but it needs to query information from Revit models or make changes to the Revit models. Um, the PyRevit Roots basically is a framework that enables or provides the platform and the framework that you need to create your own APIs on top of Revit, basically web APIs. So the way it works is that you run Revit, whatever Revit version that you're working with from 2016 to 2021, and then you have a bunch of Revit models open and stuff like that. If you have installed PyRevit, especially the new version that comes with the PyRevit Roots, you can enable the PyRevit Roots server, and you can create APIs in your PyRevit custom PyRevit extensions that you create that do whatever you need them to do. And the PyRevit Roots server and the framework will give you sort of like the feature set that you need to be able to create these APIs and run it smoothly over an instance of Revit. And then once the server is running over the instance of Revit, then you can talk to it through basically from the internet, from the outside, through browsers, through other applications that you want to create and whatnot, anything that basically can communicate over a TCP/IP protocol, HTTP protocol over TCP/IP connection, then you can access your APIs. So this is just an overview of like how the system is architected. There's a lot of details and inner cogs and stuff into it, but I'm gonna show you how it basically works with a very, very simple example. So I'm gonna minimize this, and I'm gonna go to my Windows environment, and I already have PyRevit sort of like attached to the new version of PyRevit attached to the Revit versions that I have and whatnot. So sort of like it's expected that you have figured out that part. I'm going to create a new extension, call it my web API extension. Oops, extension. So I basically create an extension directory, and inside of it, I'm going to create a startup.py script. This is the script. This is the extension initialization script that PyRevit runs whenever it loads your extension, if it's available. If you don't know about it, go to the developer documentation on the wiki and find the extension startup script, and it basically explains what these extension startup scripts are. And at the end of this video, sort of like once we have created our function and our basic web API, I'll explain to you why we're putting our API here. So I'm going to open this, and I'm going to say from PyRevit import, let's say DB, which is the Revit DB API. I'm going to create a function that says get doors. This function's purpose is to sort of like acquire the doors that are available in a model. To do that, I need a document argument. I need to pass the document argument to this function so it can query the doors and figure out where the doors are. I'm going to grab the doors from the Revit API, filtered element collector on that document, and I'm going to say of category, that would be DV built-in category, and it would be OSD doors. And I'm going to convert that to elements. So I basically grab all the doors that I need in the model, and it would give me all the elements that I would need. Let's make sure that they're also, oops, where element is not element type. Make sure we don't collect door types and just the doors. Okay, so I have a function that returns the doors. But this function, I can only use it when I am on this machine inside Revit. I can probably create a button that calls this function and collects the doors and does something to it. Let's say I have a model that I need to run from outside, and I need to be able to access from outside and collect the doors in a model, and maybe show the list of the doors and or some like mark properties and stuff like that on a web application. I need to make this function accessible from the outside world. That is what the PyRevit roots framework and API is for. So at this point, I'm going to say from PyRevit import roots, and that's the API that we're going to talk about. Now, let's talk a little about how API, sort of like web API endpoints look like. So if you browse to any website, any system that has a sort of like a web-based API, I'm going to show you maybe in a sort of like maybe in a browser. I'm going to go to the address bar and say generally you say like you define the protocol, which is the HTTP or the HTTPS protocol if the API is behind a secure connection, and then you put the API server, and then you would say like I want to access the API and the version of the API and the endpoint, whatever you want to do. Let's say like you want to collect posts on a blog. Whatever that's behind that server is determined by that web API. Not all web APIs look like this. Some of them might not have the version. Some of them might not be behind a sort of like an API path and whatnot. It just might say it's a server post. And this server could be like expanded into, I don't know, like myblog.com, whatever, right? And then it would access that, and it would access the API, get the posts, and it would do whatever it's necessary to do on the web application front end. This is the general gist of the APIs. They're sort of like directory paths. They kind of look like those, but what they really do is that there are web API calls that point to a very specific resource that we generally call them endpoints. In case of like the design of the API that we're doing, points to a very specific function. Whether that function provides a user interface experience like a web page or whatnot, or it provides logic and stuff like that, that's completely dependent on the API. But that's basically how they work. Now, imagine if this piece is pointing to the Revit server that we are running or the Revit instance that we are running. On this Revit instance, you might have PyRevit, and people could define different APIs that do different things. The PyRevit routes supports that by providing a sort of like by fixing one level of the API definition, right, the endpoint definition over that Revit instance. What that means is that whatever that comes right after the sort of like the IP and port of that machine here would be your API name. So if I'm designing an API for my extension, like Ehsan extension, all the endpoints that I have are going to be after this piece, which is my API name. And if somebody else creates a different extension, they will make sure that they put a unique name for their APIs, or they can use my name to extend the APIs that I've created as long as there's no conflicts between the endpoints. The structure is very similar to how Flask applications work in Python, or a lot of like other frameworks actually use these conventions. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to define my API. This API is kind of like a Flask application. It's it's the root of all your endpoints in your web API. So I'm going to say, give me an API, and we're going to call it my API. And then what I can do is then I can say decorate the function that I have with the HTTP verb, HTTP method get, because we are getting some resources, and put it behind the, let's say, doors. So that would be the decorator function that is provided by the routes module that would attach and sort of like register this function as the handler for that path. So what the real path for this to access this sort of like API would be, it would be something like HTTP or HTTP IP of that machine, port of the server that's running. It would be my API. Instead of IP and port, you might give this machine a DNS name. So it could be like revit.machine.local or whatever that, whatever that name of that is, that would be resolved by the DNS server. But basically, you kind of need an IP and port in here. And then my API, and this would be doors. So this is what the sort of like the resolved full path of that API endpoint is. What it does is it gets the doors through using the Revit API and executes that function and returns that data for us. Now, we haven't figured out the return part. So we sort of like created the API, imported the routes module, defined our API, and then we sort of like connected or registered our logic function to that web API endpoint. And what we're going to do is that we're going to use one of the functions of the utility function of the routes API, routes framework, that's very similar to Flask to create a response for us. And the response is going to be a list of x id.integer values, integer value for x in doors. So we're going to grab the integer value of the sort of like the ID of that door as the return data. At this point, you really can do anything. You can do inside this function, you can process whatever you want to do. And as long as you return a serializable data type that it could be serialized to JSON, so sort of the server can return that as the data, you're good to go. So this is an example of a function that collects doors over the server. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to launch Revit, let it know about this extension that's in here, and we're going to start the root server. We're going to configure it to start at Revit startup, and then ask Revit to basically run this startup script over our extension. And that's why we really put this API definitions inside a startup script. You could literally put it anywhere. Like you could put it inside a command, inside a Python, a script for a button, and then whenever you click that button, those APIs will be defined and attached to the server, and then it would be accessible. But generally, when you define a web API, you want it to be accessible at all times. So you put it on the web on the startup script. So the PyRevit will run that once at startup, and then it would be accessible through the life of that Revit instance session. So that's PyRevit loading in the background. I've disabled a couple of standard extensions for it to load a little bit faster. This is a virtual machine as usual, so it runs a little bit slower. We don't get any notification about the root server here. If the root server runs, it'll let you know what the IP and port it's running on. The way the root servers work in terms of picking the IP is that they start with a start IP that you can configure for it. The default is the default port would be 48884. That's the port that's been configured to be the default. You can set it to anything that you want, but basically the first instance of Revit that you run on that machine will pick that IP. The second instance plus the Revit plus this will pick the next one, the next available one, and then go on, so on and so forth. And then these can be like any version of Revit. And I'll show you later that how you can sort of like ask the first or any of these Revit versions about the other Revit versions that are running at get the port and stuff to be able to access them later. But let's go through the process of letting the PyRevit know about this extension. So all I have to do, I have to put add the desktop to that because I put that extension on my desktop, and I'm going to go to settings again, and I'm going to go under this new section, it's called routes, and I'm going to turn on the server. And I'm going to say save and reload. And PyRevit will reload. This time it'll load our extension, and it would execute the startup script, and it should register the API endpoints correctly. So it created the my web API extension assembly that we needed. Basically, there's nothing really in it except for the startup script. And now it's loading the rest of the stuff. Okay, so we have an error here. Method routes got an expected keyword method. I think it's methods. Okay, we're going to close this. And I'm going to run this. If I still have bugs and errors in this, I'll just copy the function that I had created from before, and we can just continue with that. Okay, we're gonna let Revit run. I'm gonna switch back to the Windows side, to the Mac OS side, which is basically a different machine. As far as we're concerned, my Windows is running inside a remote, inside a virtual machine, and this Mac OS is in a different environment. So these two have different IPs. So I'm treating the Mac OS environment as the client machine that has the browser, and the Windows machine is the one that has the web server and on top of Revit. So I'm going to sort of like use use curl here, just to sort of like quickly dive into that API. Then I'll show you how we can use Postman and stuff like that for a better environment to play with these APIs. I'm going to minimize that for now. Okay, so our let's go back to light mode. So everything ran fine. The root server is listening on the port, and that 00 sort of like IP address means that it is listening to the IP addresses to the request that's coming from everywhere on the internet, not the local machine only. So it's basically listening to everything that's coming from outside on that specific port. And that's your sort of like identification, the notification that root server has been started and it's listening. So I'm going to, this is the moment of truth. I'm going to put the IP address of that. I'm going to get rid of some of these stuff to make it a little bit simpler for now. Going to IP address of that machine that I had. So 10.111.1.143, and then that's the port number. That is not my API. I'm going to use my API. Let's make sure that's what we used for the name of the API. Yes. And then I'm going to say I need doors. So it gave me some response. Now, the response is in JSON format, so I'm going to use JQ to sort of like process that response and make it nicer. I got an exception from the root server. This is a notification. The root server also is really good with handling exceptions and returning all the results and stuff. So it says the input document of function anonymous filter collector is none. So yes, I don't have any documents open here. So it tries to sort of like run the function over a document that really doesn't exist. Actually, I should have opened the document that already has a couple of doors in it, because I don't want to go and load door models and stuff. So I'm going to close this again. And let's say open this model that has a single door in it. And actually, let's copy this wall and make multiple instances and a couple of doors. Okay, so now I do have an active document. And I'm going to go back here and I'm going to call the API again. And you can see it returns a list of the door integers for me. It's really as simple as this. This is an example of the very simple API that we have created. Your web applications have no limitations in sort of like accessing using this IP address and accessing this running instance of Revit. I have not provided a basic API. This is the beta version. I didn't provide a basic API to do like opening files and closing files and stuff like that. You are free to play with, create your own APIs, bring your own functionality that you have created into the startup script and attach it, sort of like register it as roots for a uh, basically external server to contact it. The basic feature that the basic API that PyRevit Roots provides is the one that I was playing with before. So curl, that IP, that port. The basic API is the roots, and then you can ask for the status of a server from that server, and it tells you what Revit version it's running on, and what's the username, and what's the session ID. That session ID belongs to PyRevit. It tells you which PyRevit session ID it's running on. Or you can ask for its sisters. And it tells you that on this machine, there's a Revit 19.2 is running. That's its process ID. Server host doesn't matter. That's the port that it's running on. And that's its year version for a sort of like a easier version to compare stuff by. So I'm going to, in this instance, I'm going to run the, let's say, launch array 2021. And there's no really conflicts between these two servers because they're really sitting behind different ports. So you could independently talk to any of these Revit versions that are running on your machine. I'm going to let that start up. Meanwhile, while Revit 2021 is starting up and loading the PyRevit, I'm going to show you the link here that I've placed to the inside the PyRevit Wiki. That'll take you to this page, the PyRevit Roots HTTP API. If you want to go through the wiki, go through the homepage of the wiki, find the developer documentation, and go after the basic get startups and the videos and stuff. Go here and on the core, find the PyRevit Roots, the HTTP API. And that's a page that describes basically in a lot more detail what we talked about. It gives you the same example, creating of the extensions, importing the module, the discussion that we had about how the web API endpoints pathing basically works, creating your own API, defining the function, connecting and registering it as the handler, and sort of like extending it to return the data, and all that kind of stuff. And then setting up the server, you might get a notification from the operating system that this application wants to listen to the sort of like to the outside world. It wants to connect to the internet. Do you want to allow this or not? You should allow it, whether sort of like, you are capable of allowing it on your system. That really depends on your system configuration and whatever that system administration has decided. But if for this feature to work, Revit needs to be able to have access to the outside world, be able to listen on those ports. And then sort of like an example of putting that path inside a browser and getting the same data. In this video, we tried curl because it's like, a little more colorful here and stuff. And then it takes you through the advanced routing, and then it's sort of like the arguments that you can pass on and stuff. There's one important topic that I'll have to talk about here, but and then the defining the routes, and then all the extra parameters and stuff that is available, and also providing callbacks that I'll talk a little bit about, and exception handling, and a couple of other stuff in here. Revit 2021 is running, and it has sort of like started the root server on that port number. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to assume that I'm sitting outside this machine, and I know that if there is a version of Revit, there's an instance of Revit running on that machine, it's going to be on the first port that I've configured to it. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to ask the first one. If this request doesn't return anything, it means that there's no Revit running on that machine, and sort of like there's no roots module running on those, or server is running on those machines, because the first one is always going to be that first port that you can configure for it. So I'm going to ask that first one for its sisters. The sisters are going to be the rest of the Revit instances that are running on that machine. So you can say, show me all the other ones, and it tells you there's 2021 running on that port and this. And sort of like you can ask this API for all the Revit instances and then grab the port and connect those Revit instances independently if you need to. Or you can say, sisters, give me the 2021 sisters that you have. And it would filter sort of like the results for the 2021 version of Revit. And I'll show you where these APIs are. One thing that I wanted to talk about before we sort of like get into a little bit of the inner workings of this module is that the very important topic here is that these basically the whole idea. Let me actually open this. The whole idea, the whole reason that we created this sort of a HTTP web server is to have access to Revit API context. But that doesn't mean necessarily that your handler functions are do need to have access to the Revit API context. The routes module creates this distinction by the type of arguments that you pass to your function. So if you have, and I've put this in the documentation here, if you have, if you're using UI app, UI doc, or doc in your arguments, then the routes server will fire an external event and will ask Revit to run this handler function for you inside of a Revit API context. Use sort of like ask for those arguments only if you actually need them. If you want to have access to the documents, it's always make sure always to put a document argument in here. So the route server provides the active document to you inside the environment, or you can ask for the UI document or the UI app and collect all the open documents and stuff like that, or whatever else that you need to do. You're not limited on anything basically here because you're running inside the Revit API context and you can put your transactions and stuff like that. The routes API doesn't run your functions inside a transaction, so transaction handling is by you. And that's sort of like the best practices because you know where the transactions are needed and where they're not. The routes functions cannot dig into the function, the handler function that you have created to figure out if you are making changes to the model or not, and if a transaction is necessary or not. The other thing that the API provides, this routes framework provide, is a callback system. So if the data that you're submitting to that request, if it's a sort of like the web request that you're making to this root server, contains some data and it has the callback URL parameter with some value in it, the Revit API will, the root server will ask a Revit API to run this handler for you, but will immediately return with a 204 code that says, you know, I've accepted the request, but there's no response content. Just go back. And then once it's completed its processing of that function, it'll make a callback to the callback API and it will pass the data to that callback API that you have implemented on your own somewhere else APIs or whatever. This is super helpful for when you need long running sort of like functions and stuff like that. Of course, if you're running in sort of like in a web application, you could run it on a separate thread and sort of like use promises and stuff like that for whatever they come back, the data comes back, you can process it and whatnot. But basically, the server provides that mechanism as well. So read through the documentation, take a look at those, and see if you like it or not. There's returning results that you can create, sort of like provide more information to the results. You can customize the headers that you want to return or the response status message that you want to return, and everything else is sort of like documented in here. The routes API that we played with, this sisters and status and stuff like that, they're all documented here on the first section of this. If you go to the runtime REST API, it'll take you to a page that sort of like takes you what the routes API is. You can get the status, get the sisters prompt plus an integer, which is the Revit here. And this is where the similarities between this and the Flask framework really shine. That if I, let me actually open the PyRevit source code, and I would go to the routes, and I'll show you how this. So these are the three functions that once returns the status. See, it's connected to the routes API. Routes API name is routes, and it's sitting behind the routes path. And then you can ask for a status using get. You can ask for sisters, and it would collect the data and give it back to you. Or see how this path is defined. You can ask for sisters with an integer that comes after that, and you can call it version, and it would be passed as the version argument to your function, and you can filter your results and use that data in a way that you want to. So make sure to take a look at the documentation that I provided for that kind of stuff. And then there will be at some point a PyRevit core runtime API that is responsible to sort of like configure PyRevit remotely, reload it into new sessions, install, remove extensions, and all that kind of stuff. but that's going to be for future versions. Right now, this is the public beta of this feature, and the main goal is for you guys to play with it and see sort of like what you can come up with and the ideas that you have. I'm using Postman to set up a private routes sort of like collection of these APIs, like the status and the sisters and its specific sisters and stuff like that. You can very easily use this, use the Postman to play with the APIs that you're creating. It's a very good environment for the results and stuff. You can save these functions. You can play with them from any machine. You can create different configurations for the runtime environment. For example, I've like set the PyRevit IP here and the port here, and I can very easily switch between like the first port to the second port to the third port and test different instances of Revit that's running and whatnot. I still have 2021. So for example, if I say sisters here and run it, I will ask, so basically I'm asking the first one, Revit root server 1, which is running on the 48884 for the sisters, and it gives me this data. If I switch to the second one and ask the same thing, it will give me the same data. So one time I asked Revit 2019 that's running here for the sisters, and the other time I asked Revit 2021 for all the other sisters. So all the Revit versions, basically, all the root servers know about each other running on that machine. So you can play with those, you can save those. At some point, I'll make this public and I share it with you. If you are a developer and if you get the Revit API, let me actually put that back into my my extensions directories. If you go inside the PyRevit, if you basically clone the PyRevit Git repo and you go under the PyRevit DevTools, in the startup py of the PyRevit Dev, there's a whole bunch of these like as examples and tests and whatnot. Like one of them is forms blocking. You can actually show a form to the user. I'm going to close my Revit 2019. It's going to take a little bit more time for it to load this time because it's loading a lot more extensions. But let's see if I can show you how this works. But basically, you can use Postman to create all the good API tests and stuff like that you have created here and play with them in a way that you don't have to write stuff too many times and whatnot. That's pretty much it. I think I touched all the stuff that I wanted to talk about. The main goal of this video was obviously to get you familiar with this feature, with this new feature. Yeah, you play with it. Make sure you go through the documentation. It's not very long, and especially if you're familiar with web frameworks like Flask and generally how the web APIs work and stuff like that, you should be able to go through this in a breeze. It's not really that complex, and start playing and creating your stuff and whatnot. While this is running, actually it's almost done. Don't worry about these errors and messages and stuff that you're seeing. If you have the PyRevit developer extension enabled, these error messages are intentional. They actually do test and make sure that PyRevit will show an error message where it needs to show. So the Revit server is running in here, and I have this Revit instance running, and I'm going to use one of my saved routes for show alert. So that's the PyRevit Dev API that the PyRevit developer extension creates, and then that method is forms block. I'm going to send, and if you go on the Revit side, oh, actually this is the Revit server 2. So the first Revit server, I'm going to say send, and we see a prompt for Revit. And when I say OK, then it would actually return the results to the caller. So like basically the functionalities and the opportunities are limitless. You can do whatever you need to do using this new framework. So that's pretty much it. And then I'm going to publish this video on the YouTube, and then take a look at the rest of the stuff that, the issues and whatnot that has been closed. If this is something that you cared about, the support for Revit 2021 has been added. I haven't tested all the tools under 2021. We'll sort of like fix those issues as they show up, if there's any API changes and whatnot. And then there is also a new version of the releases. There's a new version of the PyRevit CLI out. And the last thing that I wanted to show you is that if you want to set up a machine that does this sort of like API handling for you, you don't have to install the full Revit, full PyRevit on that machine with all the tools and stuff like that. I have the normal version of PyRevit installed on this, which is running from my Git repo. But I'm not sure if you're aware of this or not, but there are a couple of videos on the PyRevit CLI. PyRevit has a command line application that ships with PyRevit, and it's once you have the standard version of PyRevit installed, you should be able to access this. If you just want the CLI, that's what the PyRevit CLI is. You can download this. It's a very small download, and it only provides the command line, so you can manage the existing environments and stuff like you have. One of the features that the PyRevit CLI has is that you can clone PyRevit using different methods. The first one is what we're going to use right now. You can PyRevit clone. You can give it a name because you can have multiple clones on the same machine, so each one of them needs a unique name, and then the deployment name. PyRevit has different deployments configured for itself. So if you go to the PyRevit repo here, and then go to the sort of like the root of this PyRevit repo, there is a file that's called the PyRevit file. And if you open this, it describes what engines this PyRevit clone, what PyRevit basically the repository has. And at the end of it, it has the configurations for different deployments. You can deploy different PyRevit in sort of like using different configurations. Like the first one, core, doesn't deploy any extensions. The second one has the extensions. The third one has the extensions plus like different collections of those extensions. Base public is the one that is published with the PyRevit installer. That's the one that has all the public extensions available for everybody. But like, let's see, the PyRevit developer extension is not on this list because that's not part of the developer. That's not part of the public because like not everybody wants to play with that extension. So you can clone the core, PyRevit core, and you would get all these roots features and stuff like that without getting all the unnecessary tools. So you could say PyRevit clone. Let's say I'm going to say my PR. That's the name that I'm giving to my clone. And I'm going to say core. That's where the development name, the deployment name is. And I'm going to say like destination, put it on my C drive, PyRevit. I've already done that. It downloads probably around like 150 megabytes of data. So it's not that slow, but basically what it does is that it creates the PR directory that we told it to on your C drive, and it would place the extension inside that um, directory. And using the deployments, it actually downloads a zip archive, so it's not the full Git repo. There's no hidden directories and stuff in here. It's just PyRevit with the binaries that it needs, the PyRevit library, the Python library, and the extra library modules that it would need. And then it would add the PyRevit clone to the list of the clones that are on this machine. So if I say PyRevit clones, you can see that the development, the full Git development clone that I have is there. And then this MyPR that we just installed is also there, but it's a registered clone that's deployed from archive or images, which is a zip archive. So it's fairly small in size. Like this one, I think is about like 100 something megabytes, 120 megabyte size in disk. And now I'm going to say PyRevit attach the MyPR to Revit 2019 using the 277 IronPython 277 engine. So I've attached that to only my 2019 version. If I run 2019 right now, it'll launch from this, it'll load from this clone. And because it doesn't have any extensions, I'm actually gonna remove that one. Well, it doesn't matter. Because it doesn't have any extensions, I should have removed that extra extension, user extension directory from the configurations. But basically, because it doesn't have any extensions, it loads really fast and you won't see any buttons in the user interface. But it provides all the runtime of the API of the PyRevit. It's still in the pack. So you see it loads a lot faster because it really doesn't, it just went through that API the new extension that we created. It still runs and it's still fine, and you can still access it and do whatever you need to do with it. Oh, actually, this is the part that because it didn't load it, that API is not available. Oh, and if you notice, like if I say this, the server error, root handler not defined exception, because that extension, which was the PyRevit development, that's not available, not loaded, so that API is not available. So the server is pretty good at handling the exceptions that's happening and sort of like giving you responses and whatnot. So I can ask this server for its status, and it tells me that that's that. And sort of like the schema for these data will change in the future. I might provide the PyRevit version in here and whatnot. So sort of like, be aware that this is a work in progress project, but it's it's growing, and I think I'm pretty happy about its existence and just the fact that we can access Revit from outside now. Thank you. Let me know, test it out, and let me know if you have any ideas or if you see any errors.